CUNY Haitian Studies Institute, the Africana Studies Department of Brooklyn College, the Haitian Times, and Haiti Cultural Exchange, and many others who have made all of this possible. So for this afternoon, we're going to be taking a look at a couple of interesting topics that examine the role that Haiti and Savannah played in shaping this side of the world. Just a moment. Now, I want to start this discussion off with the whole notion of monuments and the significance of monuments. Well, monuments have a way of telling stories that are explicitly created to commemorate persons or events or that which has become relevant to a social group as part of the remembrance of historic times or cultural exchange. Now, I know that monuments throughout the United States and other parts of the world have, sometimes had a bit of controversy attached to them. But these two monuments that we're looking at, that we're going to be looking at, I think they hold enough significance that, exhibit a lot of positivity, a lot of value, a lot of worth. This one that we're looking at right now, it stands tall at Franklin Square in Savannah, Georgia, and it's commemorating an all-Black regiment of the Chasseur Volunteer de Saint-Domingue and its role in the Revolutionary War. In a moment, Natacha Brookshire will enlighten you about the Chasseur Volunteer and the role of the Threesome partners: war, Catholicism, and slavery. And later on, we will take a look at another monument, which sits at Savannah State University. It's smaller in stature, but of no less significance, and is situated on the campus of Savannah State University. And later on, Patricia West will tell you the story of the man who is, whose image is captured in this monument. His name is Richard R. Wright. And in her presentation, A Cup of Goodwill, Major Richard Robert Wright's Trans-Hemispheric Hospitality from Georgia to Haiti, she will tell you a whole lot more about the story behind this man. So let me first introduce you to Natacha Brookshire. Natacha Brookshire is a registered nurse with over 25 years of experience, and she's currently working as a manager for a hospice company. She is a cradle Catholic and a veteran of the United States Army. Natacha is the proud mother of 2 adult children and has 5 grandchildren. She obtained her bachelor's degree in nursing from Florida Atlantic University and is currently pursuing a master's degree in theology from Xavier University, Louisiana, through the Institute of Black Catholic Studies. Her postgraduate studies focus on the contribution of African American to Catholicism within the United States. For her thesis, Natacha has chosen to research the impact of the 2 groups of Haitian Catholics in the antebellum, Savannah, Georgia. And the first group of Haitians are the Chasseur Volunteer, the soldiers who fought in the 1779 Battle of Savannah during the American Revolution. And the second group are the Haitians who migrated to Savannah as a result of the Haitian Revolution. So we have a lot to discuss here. Now, a little bit of housekeeping. If you have any questions, please be sure to post those questions that you have for panelists in the Q&A. And if you have some general comments, feel free to post them in the chat. And hopefully we will get to what everyone has to ask and what everyone has to say. So without further ado, Natacha Brookshire.
Thank you so much, Margaret. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this awesome conference on the historical and cultural encounters between Haitians and African Americans. Having lived most of my life in the United States, I consider myself an African American, though I am originally from Haiti. Growing up, I was at ease in both Haitian and American cultures. As stated by Margaret, I am currently attending the Institute for Black Catholic Study at Xavier University in Louisiana, where I'm pursuing a master's in theology with an emphasis on African American spirituality. While doing research online, I came across the Haitian monument in Savannah, Georgia, and was immediately fascinated. I never knew that Haitians had fought in the American Revolutionary War, despite having studied American history during my undergrad studies in America, and I had never heard of this in my history classes as a high school student in Haiti. As an American veteran, Army veteran, who also has a son who is a veteran, I was touched by the story of the Chasseur Volunteer. The Chasseur Volunteer, as these soldiers were called, played a very important role in the 1779 Battle of Savannah, and many gave their lives and shed their blood for American freedom. For this discussion, I will use the name Saint-Domingue when referring to my native country of Haiti, because at the time the Chasseur Volunteer fought in Savannah, the country was a French colony. It has been known by many names throughout its history. The original Taino name was Haiti, A-Y-I-T-I. By the 15th century, Spanish colonizers renamed the island Hispaniola. By 1689, Spain and France were at war with each other. The war ended with the signing of the 1697 Treaty of Ryswick, by which Spain ceded the western part of the island to France. France, in turn, renamed their port Saint-Domingue and chose the port city of Cap Français as the capital. It is from this port that the Chasseur Volunteer sailed to America to fight in the American Revolutionary War in 1779. The eastern part of the island remained under Spanish rule. The island was again renamed after the successful Haitian Revolution. The name Haiti was chosen in remembrance of the original Taino name of Haiti. I will speak of the 13 British colonies when referring to the United States. France fought in the American Revolution as a result of the Franco-American Alliance Treaty of February 1778, which stipulated that France would help the 13 British colonies win their independence from Britain in return for certain commitments from Congress. The 1779 Battle of Savannah was the first joint military operation between France and the 13 British colonies. The British captured Savannah in 1778 with a force of 3,000 men commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Archibald Campbell. By March the following year, General Prevost, who had arrived a few months before, established a civil government in Georgia. Savannah was the capital of Georgia. The British were vying to overtake the Carolinas and Charleston. The Patriots, led by General Lincoln, needed reinforcement to fight successfully against the British. The French-American Alliance Treaty guaranteed help from France. The Continental under General Lincoln hoped to gain control of Savannah with the help of their new French ally. By July 1779, General Charles-Henri Hector Comte d'Estaing was in Saint-Domingue recruiting soldiers to fight in the American Revolutionary War. During the 16th and 17th century, Georgia was part of Spanish Florida. General James Oglethorpe founded the British colony of Georgia in 1733 as a place for Europeans to settle, work, and get out of debt. It was the last British colony. The newest and smallest British colony was used as a strategic barrier between South Carolina and Spanish Florida. Savannah served as a wedge against Spanish and French traders of Pensacola and New Orleans. The colony was run by a board of trustees. Catholicism, slavery, lawyers, and rum were outlawed. In 2007, the Haitian monument honoring the Chasseur Volunteer was erected on Franklin Square in Savannah, Georgia, through the untiring efforts of the Haitian American Historical Society. It took 228 years for the Haitian soldiers who fought in Savannah to be commemorated and honored. The Chasseur Volunteer soldiers were free Haitians of varying African ancestry. They fought in Savannah under French General Jean-Baptiste Charles-Henri Hector d'Estaing and alongside the Continental Army led by General Benjamin Lincoln. The battle lasted from September 23 to October 18, 1779. They fought against the British troops led by General Augustin Prevost and General John Maitland, who joined Prevost in Savannah after the French and Haitian soldiers had arrived there. The words Chasseur Volunteer literally means voluntary hunters. The reported number of Haitians who fought in Savannah varies between 545 to 1,000, depending on the source. Author and historian Doris Kadish and James Arnold state that around 800 Haitians soldiers fought alongside the Continental Army in Savannah, Georgia. It was customary for France to use Black soldiers to fight its battles. As early as 1697, to maintain control over its most profitable colony, the French military recruited troops from Saint-Domingue. The troops were made up of soldiers of all colors. For example, troops of African descent proved instrumental in the capture of Fort de la Boca Chica, located in Cartagena, a key defense port in Colombia. Captain Vincent Olivier, who was born into slavery in Saint-Domingue, was manumitted after the raid in Cartagena as a reward for his military service. The difference between him and the Chasseur Volunteer is that the chasseurs were already free, and some were even owners of plantations. Captain Vincent Olivier, like the chasseurs after him, fought on foreign soil for the French army. He fought in Germany and was promoted to Captain General of the colored troops in Cap Français. He even received a pension and some gifts from Louis XVI for his military services. Captain Vincent Olivier's military ranking afforded him many layers of privilege and power. Because of his position, he could muster his neighbors for drills on Sundays, administer censuses, capture escaped slaves, oversee road maintenance, arrest troublemakers, and settle civil disputes. Blacks who held the very ranking of Captain Olivier had wide-ranging authority and considerable social influence. They usually ran large plantations and exerted a lot of power in their parishes. The fact that he received a pension as a result of his military service is important because I was unable to locate primary sources related to pensions for the surviving Chasseur Volunteer or their dependents. Historian Shelby Thomas McCloy tells us in The Negro in France that when General d'Estaing was recruiting Black soldiers to fight in the American Revolutionary War, he was greatly assisted in his recruiting efforts by Captain Olivier Vincent. In 1764, 15 years before the battle, General Charles d'Estaing was governor of Saint-Domingue. He wanted to make free men of color the cornerstone of the colonial defense. Under threat of enslavement, free men of color were drafted into full military service from the age of 16. Newly manumitted men were drafted for 3 consecutive years of service. Historian John Garrigus informs us in his journal article titled Catalyst or Catastrophe that all men of African descent from age 16 to 60 were mandated to serve in the military. Black officers who prior to 1764 had commanded soldiers of color found themselves demoted to the ranks of sergeants or quartermasters. Those with 1/8 or less African ancestry were considered officially white and immune from all legal discrimination. Saint-Domingue's white consul opposed the plan that Governor d'Estaing wanted to enact because of the rights he was extending to non-whites. France called him back to Versailles and replaced him as governor of Saint-Domingue. In March 1779, the Count d'Argout again formed a militia composed entirely of free people of color. The Chasseur Volunteer would be utilized as a military unit in 1779. They were divided into 10 companies, and by the fall of that year, per historian Garrigus, 800 of these soldiers would take part in the Battle of Savannah. France was not the only country that utilized Black troops to maintain control over their colonies. Historian W.B. Hartgrove states that in Rhode Island, a regiment of formerly enslaved people formed 4 military companies. Enslaved and free people of color in New Hampshire, New York, and Connecticut joined the military. In his book titled Before the Mayflower, historian Bennett tells us that by 1781, Maryland had Black troops, as did Massachusetts. According to Hartford, the Continental Army had at least 4,000 Negro soldiers. Black people fought in America and in Haiti either to gain their freedom or to acquire more rights as citizens. Historians have stated that prior to fighting their own successful revolution in Haiti, several leaders of the Haitian Revolution fought in the 1779 Battle of Savannah. Some cite Beauvais, Rigaud, Villat, Beauregard, Lambert, and others cite Henri Christophe, the future king of Haiti. It was extremely difficult for me to locate primary sources that supported some of these claims. Claude Adrien cites the generation of Haitian leaders who took part in the siege of Savannah as Jean-Baptiste Marbelly, Louis-Jacques Beauvais, Marshal Besse, and André Rigaud. The Chasseurs Volunteers were also called the Fontage Legion because François Vicomte de Fontage was their major general. The names of 25 Chasseurs Volunteers are enshrined on the Haitian monument in Savannah. The Chasseurs Volunteers were all free men of color who supposedly volunteered to join General d'Estaing. Military service was one option, always open to people of African descent in Saint-Domingue. Laws were enacted that constrained them to join the military. Saint-Domingue had a special force called the Maréchaussée. Attacking Maroon communities was part of the duties of the Maréchaussée. By 1730, the Maréchaussée regulations mandated free people of color to be members of the unit with only one catch. They could not be officers. The Maréchaussée were slave catchers and monitored enslaved people on plantations. This knowledge helped me to understand why perhaps the Haitian soldiers would be called chasseurs volontaires or voluntary hunters. The great majority of the chasseurs volontaires either died or were wounded in Savannah. Their mission lasted 2 months, and the soldiers who survived were immediately sent on other missions. Around 150 to 200 of them went to Grenada and remained there for more than 2 years. Some did not return home to Saint-Domingue for at least 3 years, and a few went with General d'Estaing to France after fighting in Savannah. Upon his arrival in Savannah on Thursday, September 16, 1779, General d'Estaing demanded that British Major General Augustin Prevost surrender to the King of France. General d'Estaing granted General Prevost a 24-hour delay in surrendering. The requested delay was a military ruse that provided time for Lieutenant Colonel John Maitland and his troop to join Prevost. The total number of Allied troops was 5,000, and the British had around 3,000 soldiers. An enslaved African American named Kwame Dali helped General Maitland and his troop navigate the terrain and circumvent the Continental Army and its allied forces. Kwame Dali showed Maitland a passage known as Wall's Cut, where small boats could easily navigate. It was because of Kwame's help that the British were able to receive military reinforcement. The British did not surrender to General d'Estaing. The Chasseurs Volunteers distinguished themselves in the 1779 Battle of Savannah. their most heroic actions occurred in the early morning of Saturday, October 9th, when the Continental Army and its allies led a full frontal attack on Spring Hill Redoubt. It is the day the Chasseur Volunteer made history. French General d'Estaing was in command of the Allied troops, and General Abraham Lincoln was second in command. During the battle, the French Reserve Column was commanded by General Louis-Marie Dayen de Noailles. Irish troops were under the command of Colonel Arthur Dillon, and his column supported General d'Estaing. The Chasseurs Volontaires were commanded also by Major General de Fontage and Colonel Laurent François Lenoir, Marquis de Rouvray. The British, thanks to the reinforcement provided by General Maitland's troop, made a strong counterattack that decimated the attacking forces. General d'Estaing was twice wounded. He was shot in the arm and in the thigh. His second in command, Major General de Fontage, sustained severe wounds and was carried off the battlefield. He was replaced by the Irish Colonel Dillon. Colonel Dillon ordered a retreat, triggering a chaotic mass exodus of soldiers from the battlefield into the swamps. General de Noailles commanded his French reserve column made up of the Chasseurs Volontaires to stem the British onslaught by providing cover for the retreating Allied soldiers. The Chasseurs Volontaires performed what Theophilus Gould Stewart called, and I quote, "most brilliant feat of the day, and one of the bravest ever performed by foreign troops in the American cause. They met the fierce charge of Maitland and saved the retreating army," end quote. After the retreat, 270 men, chiefly French, were found dead, upward of 80 of them laid in the ditch. French deserters reported that up to 1,800 men had either been killed or were wounded. Historian G.P. Clark states that some of the bloodiest fighting of the Revolutionary War took place in Savannah. As I mentioned before, finding primary sources naming the Chasseurs Volontaires and their specific individual role in the battle is quite difficult. Unknown number of Chasseurs Volontaires died in Savannah, but one known survivor lived to be over 100 years old. In February of 1855, the Savannah Republican newspaper gave tribute to Monsieur de Bordeaux, who was in his 30s during the 1779 Battle of Savannah. He fought alongside the French as a Black patriot during the American Revolution and was wounded in the hip. The article stated that he was near the Polish general Casimir Pulaski when he died and could tell people where this general was buried. After the battle, Mr. de Bordeaux returned to his native Saint-Domingue, but left during the Haitian Revolution, at which time he settled in Savannah. Another French archival document listed an enlisted soldier named Henri Boujon, a native of Brière, France, and a soldier in the Cap Français Regiment, 1st Battalion, Company of Dumouriez. Henri Boujon died on Saturday, October 9, 1779, in Savannah. A note at the bottom of this French document provides his family with information on who to contact and what details to provide to obtain his death certificate. I was unable to locate any document of such for the Chasseurs Volontaires. After the Chasseurs Volontaires left Savannah, on December 9, 1779, the Royal Georgia Gazette informed its reader that the French Army, colored brigade of Negro and mulatto, consisting of about 700 men, had left. The article details the threat under which the Chasseurs Volontaires and African Americans were fighting, because if captured by the enemy, they would be enslaved and sent to the West Indies. The article also informed its reader that a bill was brought forth to disarm Black soldiers and that they would be subjected to prosecution now or later, or at a later time, for having stolen and sold cattle. Any and all Black soldiers were subject to having, and I quote, every white man put the militia law in executees and disarm them, end quote. The Chasseur Volunteer played a strategically vital role in Savannah on September 9, 1779. By Sunday, October 17, the British were informed that the French mulatto and Black brigade had left. The British won the battle in Savannah and occupied the city until they voluntarily withdrew under 1782. It can be argued that racism played a part in the order the Chasseur Volunteer received while in battle that Saturday morning in Savannah. Black soldiers were denied leadership positions, were ordered to take the lead during an onslaught from which white soldiers were retreating. The unmarked grave of these free men, the difficulty in finding primary document listing them by name, and the length of time it took for any official recognition of their bravery in action are striking evidence of the irreverence which they endured even as they were fighting and dying for the freedom of a foreign country. According to historian George P. Clark, archives are a dubious source of reliable information pertaining to the Chasseur. The consistent lack of archival history, documents concerning the Chasseur can be construed as a deliberate and concerted act of suppression. In the context of the atomic effect of the Haitian Revolution on European power and control, it is not surprising that their exploit would be shrouded in silence and buried in the annals of forgetfulness. All means necessary would have been employed by the enemies of the First Black Republic to diminish, devalue, and extinguish the accomplishment of its leaders. Unfortunately, many catastrophes compounded the difficulties in finding primary sources related to the Chasseur Volunteer. The entire Haitian government's record were wiped out when explosion destroyed the National Palace in 1862 and again in 1912. In 1879, treaties, agreements, and diplomatic correspondences held by the foreign ministry were destroyed in a fire. During the Bloody Week of 1883, almost every government bureau and files were destroyed by fire. And finally, in 1888, the rebuilt archive building burnt to the ground. People of African descent fought on both sides of the conflict during the American Revolution. An untold story of the American Revolution is the part, and I quote, African Americans played in the tumultuous Stamp Act riots. Many people of African ancestry distinguished themselves during the American Revolution. The mulatto Crispus Attucks was the hero on the memorable night of the Boston Massacre. Blacks fought at Lexington and at the bridge in Concord. They fought on Bunker Hill and served by the thousands in the Continental Army as well as on the British side. Many enslavers sent the people they held in bondage as a substitute to fight in their place. Each of New England's 13 colonies had troops of African descent, including South Carolina and Georgia. Historical and cultural encounters between Haitians and African Americans were present from the very beginning. African American and Haitian history intersected in Savannah, Georgia. Yet this intersection started as a common history when captured Africans were taken off the shore of the motherland and sent into the crucible of the transatlantic slave trade. It is extremely vital for us to know our common history so that we may forge a strong, unbreakable bond as we continue to struggle and fight for equality. Thank you so much for listening.
And thank you. Thank you so much, Ms. Natacha Brookshire. That was a wonderful presentation. Let's give her a round of applause. And just again, I remind you, post your comments in the chat. If you have a specific question for the panelists that we can answer later on after the presentation, please do so by posting it in the Q&A. Okay, so Let me introduce you to Professor Patricia Ann West, who is an assistant professor of English and African diaspora literature at Savannah State University, where she focuses on African American literature that is influenced by place, space, and cultural studies. And besides interest in the historical significance of her conference subject, Richard R. Wright, Sr., and his ties to Haiti, her research presentations and publications focus on author James Allen McPherson, as well as Flannery O'Connor, both Savannah natives, and the mapping of Gullah Geechee narratives in American literature. So since 1991, Professor West has published poetry, scholarly peer-reviewed articles, reviews, and chapters, and she has presented at numerous workshops and conferences from Belize City, Central America, to coast United States locations. And her latest work, a creative piece, is entitled Still Water Words, Poems and Stories from Ancestral Places. So without further ado, please welcome Professor Patricia Ann West. Please turn on your microphone.
Yes, yeah, I'm unmuting myself. All right, can y'all hear me?
Yes.
All right, very good. Thank you all so much for that very warm introduction, Margaret. I feel privileged to be a guest speaker this afternoon. I've never done anything officially for any New York institutions. So let me thank Margaret, my colleague at Savannah State University, for inviting me. I also want to acknowledge my fellow panelists today for her very interesting presentation and the way she delivered it in that with that very story-like tone. I also want to thank the session participants, because you didn't have to decide to use your time in this way. And as a native Savannian, I'm proud to bring you greetings from our historic city, where our mayor, Van R. Johnson II, is a native New Yorker serving as our mayor. And I know he would want me to mention that. So I look forward to your questions and comments later in the hour. So let's get started. I have titled my talk, A Cup of Goodwill, Major Richard R. Wright's Trans-Hemispheric Hospitality from Georgia to Haiti. And so, although I'm not on campus today, all respect and honor are due to Major Wright, his family, some who were actually born there on the campus, which is a former place of enslavement, the Placentia Plantation, and also to his living descendants. One, Dr. Carolyn Jordan, who is actually employed there now with the Richard Wright program. So let me tell you a little bit about Major Richard R. Wright. As a newly emancipated young boy coming out of enslavement in the state of Georgia, Richard R. Wright declared to General Howard, "Tell him we're rising." Rising from a boy to a man, Wright went on to become a trailblazer in education, politics, banking, and I'm declaring also he was a forerunner of hemispheric relations. 16 years after the end of his tenure as the founding president of Georgia State Industrial College for Colored Youths, now Savannah State University, Wright embarked on several voyages to Haiti to solidify an economic venture to import Haitian coffee into the United States. This discussion will trace the origins and involvement of Wright's relationship with the Haitian people and leaders, share some archival records, and disrupt previous narratives about his seemingly lack of empathy for the peasant workers. We will examine documentation of his creation of the Haitian Products and Trading Company. And of particular interest is the documentation surrounding several voyages and the 1939 Goodwill flight to Haiti. So I am going to be sharing some information with you just to make it a little more interesting. But let me pose a few questions that we might think about. So how does the business side of Wright reconcile or not with his identity as a post-Reconstruction civil rights leader? By shedding light on the historic encounters and using the tools of hemispheric studies, which question empire and colonialism, this presentation will interject the underrepresented name of Army Major, college president, and businessman Richard Robert Wright, and thereby examine the significance of his efforts in the history of African American activism and actions in Haiti. I begin by briefly reflecting on a couple of quotes to set just a theoretical framework. So first, when considering differences in culture and place, I like to draw from Mary Louise Pratt. I know we all have our favorite people from which we use, and she is one of them. I find her idea about contact zones interesting, as she writes in chapter 1 of Imperial Eyes, Travel Writing and Transculturalization. Haiti, with its history of enslavement, revolution, colonization, and imperialism, fits the frame. According to Pratt, a contact zone is made up of, quote, social spaces where disparate cultures meet, clash, and grapple with each other, often in highly asymmetrical relations of domination and subordination, such as colonialism and slavery, or their aftermaths, as they are lived across the globe today. I'm going to show you today how the experiences of an emancipated Richard Wright influence the travels to Haiti and relationships with the Black Haitian government. Another helpful strategy is to approach this talk with hemispheric studies as a basis for erasing borderlines and recognizing the Americas as land where enslaved Africans worked on plantations in South, Central, and North America, thereby sharing a lived experience, not limited to certain countries. In other words, Janice Radway of the American Studies Association would posit that plantation slavery was not nation-based. Add to this outlook the conclusion of Susan Gilman that, quote, hemispheric studies would always operate not just in 2 or even 3 dimensions, but in multiple, asymmetrical, and non-parallel dimensions, multiply related and arrayed. I maintain that Richard R. Wright Sr. recognized the reality of a global South before his time in the pre-mid-century decades, and as Gilman described in writing in 2008. I'm going to start sharing my screen now, if that's okay, Dr. Cox.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. I want you to visualize his movements. Okay, let's see. All right. Let's see. I'm trying to get it to show as a slideshow. Okay, there we go. All right, so I've pinpointed several key places in the Global South. Let's start here with his birthplace in Dalton, Georgia, where my cursor is pointing, a small town outside of Savannah. He and his family were enslaved there. Major Wright was bought and sold 3 times as a child. His after education and his wonderful biography, which you can read in The Black Boy of Atlanta by Elizabeth Ross Haynes, he ended up coming to Savannah, hired as the first and founding president of Savannah State University in 1890. There he would stay for 30 years. And I'm saying to you all today, so you might say, well, what is the connection to Haiti? The experiences that happened in Savannah fortified Major Wright for his travels in the future, his physical travels and also those symbolic travels that he would endure. And those fortifications enabled him with courage and confidence to accomplish major things here in Haiti. All right. So against this backdrop of a global South, and again, Susan Gilman gives us that phrase. I think she was speaking in around 2008 at a conference, and she projected that descriptor. We'll see how Major Wright followed a pathway in the global South that took him from Dalton to Savannah to Haiti in pursuit of good coffee. Now, I can't say the French words like my colleague Natacha, but bon café, good coffee. All right, and there is Richard R. Wright, born in 1855, lived until 1947. It's wonderful to transcend 2 centuries. I tried to capture 2 different periods of his life there. The second one was when he was around 67 years old. He left Georgia to enroll in the Wharton School of Business in Pennsylvania. And that is what took him to that part of the country. Now, here's an excerpt from Howard at Atlanta. We have to go back to 1855 and shortly after that, right? Howard at Atlanta is a poem that was penned by the American poet, the anti-slavery poet, John Greenleaf Whittier. In Howard at Atlanta, he writes in the 5th stanza, and Wright is about 12 years old. At age 12, he unknowingly took on the role of an ambassador, a representative voice dispatching a message from the North to the South. This would function, in my opinion, as a forerunner to hundreds of occasions during which he demonstrated his ability to extend goodwill and communicate. So let's take a look at this excerpt. Maybe you've had a time to peruse it. And he said, and let me back up and maybe paint a picture for you. Some of us attended segregated schools. From time to time, some figure would come around to inspect the schools, the children who were in those places, and that started during Reconstruction. This is such an occasion where General Howard, for whom Howard University is named, came to inspect this boxcar school in Atlanta. He and his mother had walked 300 miles over a period of weeks so that she could get him into the boxcar school. Old unused train cars that were now being used to educate formerly enslaved children. And so the children are all gathered around. Everyone is afraid to speak up, except for one. And he said, "Who here can never fear for or doubt you? What shall I tell the children up north about you?" Then ran round a whisper, a murmur, some answer devising, and a little boy stood up. "General, tell him we're rising." In the fifth stanza of this poem, told from a third person point of view, eyewitness account to record this occasion, Whittier decides to bring in a second voice, that of Wright, when he looks up to deliver his famous words. The poem then becomes conversational. Upon further analysis, we see signs that this Georgia boy knows at an early age to exhibit goodwill with respect, hence addressing Howard by his title, General. This event led to Whittier inspiring the first nickname or title for Wright, the Little Black Boy. Other titles would follow in his 94 years of life: Major, Principal, President, Editor, Importer, and many others. So again, we're looking at these early years and how they prepared him for his dealings in Haiti. So as we move on, it is important to point out the importance of Haiti as a symbol of hope and freedom dangled before the enslaved toilers in the United States. So we know the difference in the years, emancipation in the British colonies and emancipation in the colonies of the United States. The 1833 Slavery Abolition Act stamped out slavery throughout the British colonies and took effect on August 1, 1834. Brandon R. Bird, whose works I've enjoyed reading recently, assistant professor of history at Mississippi State, has done extensive research on Haiti and Africans in the United States. In his essay, Black Republicans, Black Republic, African Americans, Haiti, and the Promise of Reconstruction, Dr. Bird describes the celebratory parades, games, and picnics held by Blacks in Chicago to mark the anniversary of enactment of the 1833 Abolition Act. Further, Dr. Bird draws links between two facts. In 1862, US President Abraham Lincoln recognizes Haiti by appointing a commissioner to the independent Black nation. A year later, he signs the Emancipation Proclamation. Bird points out the hemispheric developments and significance in this way. The efforts made to link the experiences of Blacks in the USA to those of Blacks in Haiti reflected a providential and transnational view of history shared by myriad African Americans. Regardless of their former status or place of birth, African Americans understood the Haitian Revolution, the recognition of Haitian independence, and the Emancipation Proclamation as related developments that foreshadowed the deliverance of Black people from bondage and oppression to a state of freedom and political equality. What has happened to the spirit of solidarity with Haiti? How does it manifest itself today and where? Wright was no stranger when he began his international travels because of this shared experience. Wright's international travels began in 1919 while living in Savannah and serving his last 2 years as president of Georgia State Industrial College for colored youth. Now, you would not find it easy to read this old document because of the penmanship, the typing is very hard to read, but I will tell you pretty much what it says, and it just gives basic information, place of birth, year, date, that kind of thing, parents. And you know what I noticed looking at these old passport records? No question about race. That was interesting. So that's one of the outcomes of this research. In 1919, he was bound for England, France, and Belgium aboard the SS France to, quote, study school conditions. At 64 years old, Richard Wright sailed from New York. I'm sorry, let me back up. I'm getting ahead of myself here. I'm so excited about this. But the significance of this 1919 application, noted in other sources, is that only a few African Americans held passports during this time. And he was one of those. And I've read in other places, even then he was urging the students at Georgia State Industrial to have a global mindset. And he certainly did set a model for that. All right, so let's continue to move through this timetable where he's fortifying himself. He's further getting ready. So a lot happened from 1919 to 1934. So we're going to skip to those events that relate to his business in Haiti. I maintain that Major Wright was not driven by purely economic or entrepreneurial motivations. Before Wright's business interests were manifested, he had a scholarly interest in what we now consider hemispheric American studies. According to Tuskegee alumnus and retired reference librarian Robert Fikes, Jr. of San Diego State University, quote, "Lay historians in this period were glad to discover and publicize heretofore unrecognized Black heroes in the tropics. Richard Robert Wright, a banker and founder of Savannah State College, had a piece originally carried in American Anthropology, reprinted in Phylon, titled Negro Companions of the Spanish Explorers." So the original was written in 1902, republished in 1941, which among other things did much to rehabilitate the reputation of Estebanico. In 1902, Wright wrote about Negroes in the exploration of the New World and became one himself. Commenting on this publication in 1941, Major Wright wrote, "I began these researches during a summer studentship at Harvard. There I was in touch with Justin Winston and John Fiske. The former wrote me when I inquired why his references to the part Negroes played in American discoveries were so meager in his narrative and critical history of America, that he had not regarded the Negro as a, quote, historical character. That riled me, and I determined to get all the information and facts. Thanks to Wright's colleague and fellow Atlanta University alumnus, Rufus Clement, we have this suggestion that the major was genuinely concerned with the global and hemispheric presence of Blacks. Again, ahead of his time, Wright disrupts the old racist narrative with truth and provides counter storytelling from a voice of color. Uh-oh, what do you know? Major Wright was already practicing critical race theory, counter storytelling, and disclosing truths. As I see it, travel was a way to extend this academic work. So again, work and experiences in Savannah created a pathway to Haiti. Wright's outreach to Haiti was intentional and consistent from 1933 to the start of World War II. So now, what about Haitian coffee? In this final segment of my presentation, I'm simply going to trace the development of the Haitian Coffee and Products Company and set up a visual timeline. So in 1934, January, Wright and his daughter Harriet, who was born actually on the campus, take a 6-day trip to Port-au-Prince, departing from the port of New York. An account of that trip was published in the Baltimore African American in March 1934. And I love sharing these old documents. This is a copy of the passenger list because they're so telling. And Wright is listed here along with his daughter, who was married at the time. And so her surname at that time was Lemon, Harriet Wright Lemon. And that's another thing, when digging into the archives, I'm sure you know, Ms. Brookshire, things change, names change, and it throws you off track. All right. So although the article is chiefly a social account, she does note this comment. And again, just further documentation of that trip in 1934, misspelled words, and you're going to encounter that, but don't be discouraged. So in 1934, this is the year after his wife Lydia passes away. He and the daughter are traveling together. He is 78 years old, as you can see. This man was spry and feisty, and nothing was going to stop him. In this article for the Baltimore African American, Ms. Wright Lemon writes, Haiti is a colored country owned and controlled by colored people. That is why it is referred to as the Black democracy. Imagine a colored head of an entire country on the American continent. And I think that's what the white leadership was so afraid of during that time. And it is explicitly written about in other sources. So Wright Lemon is smart and savvy not to make waves or upset these critics, while her father is trying to build relations. And another thing she did, I don't know if it was strategic or not, she never mentions Major Wright by name. She only refers to him as my father. Harriet Wright Lemon played no political role at this time. As I said, she was mainly a social support system for her father. She functioned as a non-participant observer except for her writing. But this is how I analyze this. She was a 28-year-old African-American female doing business travel in 1934 on behalf of the Negro Bankers Association. She herself was already a banker at 28 years old. Continuing on in our timeline. So that was in February. Here we are now in October 1934. Haiti sent 2 delegates to the Emancipation celebration in Philadelphia. It was a spirit of shared liberation as shown on the flyer. And the names of the 2 Haitian delegates are listed there. They're provided there. But being the smart, savvy person that the Wrights are, this flyer also contains just a very tiny small ad for their Haitian coffee, if you can see that, and other things that they were doing. Although we celebrate National Freedom Day now and Emancipation, the Emancipation Day, they had 30 booths at that time. And again, Haiti, Liberia, and the Virgin Islands were represented. So there was this shared experience of a love for liberation that was global, not limited just to Blacks in the US. All right, moving on to February 1935. All right, 64-year-old Richard Wright sailed to Haiti aboard the SS France. Being brave to board a ship of that size, I would say. I don't know how we're doing on time, but I'll try to get through this quickly.
I'm going to interject 3 more minutes.
3 more minutes, okay.
Yes.
Going through it quickly. Thank you very much. Here we have an article from the Pittsburgh Courier, February 1935, praising Wright for his efforts. A consignment of 310 bags of Haitian coffee arrived from the Negro Republic for the Major the other day. Prosperity comes through trade, and Major Wright has persuaded Afro-America to drink Haitian coffee than which there is none better anywhere. I'm very impressed by his business savvy, and he also involved the entire family, not only Harriet, his daughter, but his other sons as well. Here we have an ad from the Pittsburgh Courier, but I wanted to point out that these ads for, and I discovered this too, he actually named the coffee R.R. Wright Sr.'s Genuine Haitian Coffee, right? I wish I could taste it, but no can do. They were advertising across the country. So this was no fly-by-night business. A number of impacts were made. As I said, he launched an advertising campaign across the US. Here's an example of one of those ads. News was published across the country, from little old Macon to Miami to the California Eagle, Montana, you name it. They were getting coverage. He also demonstrated diversification into aviation. He bought his own airplane. How many Blacks were doing that at the time? He created jobs and continue to express a desired Black nationalism, right? So these are just some other documents. There's in 1939, he stands outside the plane he purchased and used for the Goodwill flight to Haiti. He had his own pilot among these Black men here, just very impressive, right? And so to I'm just gonna quickly go through this. There's Harriet, Mike Hines' daughter, son-in-law. By the time Harriet did pass away in 1990, she had transitioned from being the quiet little daughter to gaining her own strengths. She was known as the soul of National Freedom Day. And so in conclusion, these are the significant points I get out of just looking over the Haitian Coffee and Products Trading Company. Express solidarity, shared experiences of the emancipated. There were no statements about, well, your enslavement was worse than mine. Enslavement was enslavement. The freedman and the reconstructed man on whatever continent were all seeking human rights, opportunities, respect, and prosperity. And lastly, I'm going to say that we have exemplification of Black economic and business intelligence, early signs of Black business magic. So that ends my presentation. I do have a number of works cited if anyone is interested, and also my contact information. Sorry
Okay.
I went over.
Thank you, Professor West. You know, I know that both of you have done extensive research, and I know that you encountered the use of artifacts in the archives. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And, you know, I'm definitely going to be looking into these when I do further research about the Caribbean, with Haiti in particular in mind. And yes, I see a comment in the chat. We will get you some authentic Haitian coffee, Professor West.
Oh, I'm gonna order some next week. I've got. I'm just gonna click deliver in my Amazon box.
Okay.
But if anyone knows of a good one already, I am a coffee connoisseur, so let me know.
Now, you raised an interesting point. You made a statement about how Richard R. Wright, he began to talk about this notion of the global mindset. So my question to both Professor West and Ms. Brookshire, how can we continue to accomplish this idea of a global mindset in modern times in terms of the relations, especially between African Americans and Haitians? How can we achieve this?
I would like to say, as I was listening to Patricia speaking, I was very impressed. Beautiful delivery. I learned a lot, and I'm like, wow. I think one of the major obstacle is that we don't know our history. And because so like Pan-Africanism is always starting anew, right? Each generation is starting anew, because we can look at what Mr. Wright did and learn what was the mistake, what were the things that didn't fail, why did it fail, learn from that, and then build on what he did so that we can build that global Pan-Africanism, because it's nothing new. We've been trying to do that. What touched me very much about what Patricia was saying was the fact that here you have Mr. Wright looking at the economic development of Haiti. Right? When you had embargoes going on, you had all kinds of things going on that was strangling Haiti from being successful, coming from the pearl and going down to the ditch of poverty and struggling and everything. So I think learning the past, what we're doing right now, is extremely important in order for us to move forward and continue.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. I think he was encouraged, knowing his past. He had been a peasant himself. And so those who say, well, he and Harriet had no sympathy for the workers on the coffee plantations, I just don't buy that. I think he was being strategic. and intentional. He was trying to find the best way not to burn the bridges. The idea was to get the coffee into the US along with other products maybe, and to provide these people with a respectable way to make a earned living, an earned wage. So I think we can continue to foster this idea of a global mindset. We have to talk to this generation and have them visualize you need a passport. We have continued to do that in our global mission. I know Dr. Cox would agree, at Savannah State, international programs, encouraging our students not to be afraid to go out there. You're not limited. I wish I had known this when I was younger. When those recruiters were coming through, oh, we can get you a job on a cruise ship. Well, just being afraid of water and being afraid, never having been on a boat before, there were certain things we didn't even consider. Now, all you have to do is say, travel to me, and I'll say when. So I think we have to continue to pay attention. I do know that there is a delegation from Haiti in Savannah this week. They were on the news yesterday. One of the things we err in is not passing on information in time. Had no idea until after the fact. The gathering had already taken place. I don't know if Dr. Cox knows this. It had already taken place at the monument. And so we've missed opportunities to reach out and continue the dialogue. And so maybe that's a second way that we can continue with this global mindset. Preparing ourselves to travel legally and continuing conversations.
Okay. I think we have time for one more question. Something came up during Ms. Brookshire's presentation regarding the Catholic Church. I started talking about monuments. There is a monument in the form of a Catholic church, the Cathedral Basilica of St. John the Baptist in Savannah, the city of Savannah. And I'm interested, what role did that church or that congregation of that church play in the lives of the free and enslaved Africans who migrated, not after the Revolutionary War, but after the Haitian Revolution? What role did they play? And what role do churches continue to play in both the Haitian and African American communities?
Well, spirituality has always been very central and important in African culture. But you also see Catholicism and religion playing a vital and central role in the implementation of colonization and in maintaining the system of slavery and maintaining the hierarchy of white supremacy. And in Savannah, after the Haitian Revolution, you saw the biggest migration of people from the island and French people migrating into the United States. A lot of them went to Louisiana, but some came to Savannah. And in Savannah, the Haitians and the French who migrated there were the ones who were the Catholic Church, right? And the priests who were actually, who became the first pastor, like Father Carl and Father Le Mercier, both of those priests had been in Haiti and came to Savannah. And there's a relationship, there's a correlation between those who fought during the American Revolutionary War and came back to Savannah. So you have like somebody like Cotino who had fought right in Savannah. You find that Cotino and Father Carl were actually, after they left Haiti, right? Because Cotino had a plantation in Haiti during the Haitian Revolution. He leaves Haiti, they go to Pennsylvania, and who goes to Pennsylvania with him but Father Carl? And they had the asylum. The asylum was going to be like a refuge place for Frenchmen to come and build a French colony and have something there. And Father Carl and Coutinho ended up buying a bunch of shares and had thousands of acres of land that they had purchased in Pennsylvania. And then when that endeavor failed, they came to Savannah together, and Coutinho ends up dying in Father Carl's quarters where he was staying at the time. So there is a great correlation, and the impact of Haitian in bringing the Catholic Church. I think one of the things that we overlook a lot of times is there's something about European ancestry and the way that it's narrated is that if you're born in Haiti, but somehow you still remain a European, but an African who's born in Haiti has lost his identity and lost his ancestry and become purely a Haitian, has no other history. So you find that, whites who were born on the island come here, are very much active. And along with there was a family called the Mirold family, who had enslaved people and free people. They had people who looked like white, who passed, and they had the whole hierarchy of the society was encapsulated in this family, and they're very active in the community. You also find that within the Catholic Church, there was I don't know if people recall that during my narration, I spoke about Kwame Dali, who helped Maitland when he was trying to get to General Prevost in order to support and give military reinforcement. Well, Kwame Dali's granddaughter ends up being baptized in the Catholic Church, right? Along with those people from Haiti who came to Savannah. So you find that African-American Kwame Dali was on the British side, and you had the Haitians fighting on the American side, the Continental Army side. But here you go, next generations, they're together in the Catholic Church, and his granddaughter's being baptized. Kwame actually ended up getting his money for his participation in helping the British, and he took that money and bought his freedom and that of some of his family. And it's so mind-boggling. You have in the registry at St. John the Baptist, you have his son's name there, and his granddaughter is born to an enslaved woman. And it boggles your mind that we're going right back again every generation, and we're struggling against the system that we're helping.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to end on that note. I don't know if it's a positive note or a negative note, but it's a note nonetheless. Yeah, we went a little bit over time. We went 3 minutes over time, but I think we're good. So thank you.
May I say one little thing?
Real quick.
Okay, real quick. Okay, we spoke about the monument. If any of you ever come to Savannah, I will invite you to come go to the actual battlefield, feel the spirits, actually maybe pay respect. I would surmise that those people that Natacha referred to, those killed, the blood that shed, it's right there on the battlefield, separate from where the monument is. I'll be glad to host you and take you down there.
Okay, great. Okay, so we don't want to keep you any further. We do have something wonderful coming up next, our keynote with Dr. Gerald Horne. It will go live in about 10 minutes. And thank you again to both panelists, Ms. Brookshire and Professor West, for a wonderful presentation. And I don't think that this is the last that we're going to be hearing from these two panelists. The conference will be back again, either next year or the year after. So we'll see what lies ahead. Again, thank you. Have a great day. And I will see you all at the keynote by Dr. Gerald Horne. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Dr. Horne.
Hello, hello.
Lily Surratt from the Haitian Studies Institute.
Oh, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. We're always thrilled to have you because I remember at our inaugural, you were there.
Oh, yes, of course, of course.
Yes, and it's wonderful to have you. We have about 9 minutes before we start again. Thank you so much for being our keynote and for engaging in this conversation.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
A very important conversations, which we hope as we exit, there'll be greater collaborations among these two collectivities, you know.
Mhm. Well, I'm rather presumptuous in my remarks. I outline a number of initiatives for your institute to pursue.
Oh, I'm looking forward. I'm looking forward. I'm ready to embrace it.
Oh, I see. So excuse my being presumptuous. And
we are one community, and I think it's all about growth and evolving. So I'm sure you will be bringing us things to make us better, to make us grow, and to make us what we hope to be. We're dreaming of being that place where not only we will be the space that bring various Black communities together, but also a place where when one is seeking to understand the Haitian experience in the Americas, you will have to make a stop. That will be your number one destination.
oh, okay, fair enough. So how's attendance today?
Well, we know we're being retransmitted around the world. So far it's averaging about 30, 35 between us and others, but we're rebroadcasting. It's live, and we know, believe it or not, one of our partners, ofLouisiana TV and radio, we broadcast an event that we did last week, and about 3,000 people around the world was watching.
Oh, that's very good.
So we're very happy about the partnership of the Haitian American Foundation for Educational and Cultural Exchange, who started this initiative of Haitiana radio and TV, and stayed with it. And it's heard around the world, it's watched around the world, and they retransmit our events all the time.
Fantastic.
Yeah. So we have about 6 more minutes. Everybody else is here? Members of the executive committee, yes.
I'm here, still here.
Okay, excellent. Aslan. We've all gathered because everybody wanted to hear it. The presentation,
I'm still here. Can you hear me?
Oh yes, Gerald.
Yeah, we're here from France.
Yes. And I know
it's actually it's almost 9 o'clock at night. Yeah.
Wow. That's one member of the executive committee. We've been around the world because Gerald is in France and he's always there no matter what. Is in Canada. Vermonja is in Canada.
Absolutely.
So it's just amazing community that we created about a year ago that brought this. And indeed, Margaret, there's no question about it. Every May, which is Haitian Heritage Month, we intend to bring a version of these conversations.
Good.
That's going to be a permanent addition to the Institute. Like every May, Haitian Heritage Month, we will come together and talk about Haiti in the world, Haiti and its friends, Haiti with the non-friends.
I see.
With some friends, we don't need enemies, you know.
I hear that.
With some friends, you don't need enemies. So, which has been, one of the things that the Institute will boldly say. I mean, if our neighbors to the north are our friends, why are they doing so well and we're not doing that well?
Excuse me, I have some good news. The Minister of Education has been appointed here in France, and he happens to be a Black scholar from Senegal. Woo! His name is Pape Ndiaye. He's a well-known scholar in history. I think perhaps Professor Horne may know him, Pape Ndiaye. So, well, maybe not. I'm not exactly sure because I'm very Franco-centric. I think everybody revolves around France because I hold a doctorate in French studies and French colonial history. So I'm a bit Franco-centric. So anyway, the point is that I'm living in France, and our President Macron was re-elected for a second term, so that'll be 10 years of Macron. And he just appointed a Black Senegalese as his Minister of Education. I think this is great news. But it's very political. It's kind of calculated. It's tokenism, but it's a step in the right direction. What do you think, Professor Horne? Dr. Horne, sorry.
Well, I noticed he also appointed a woman as prime minister. Apparently, there is concern about these upcoming parliamentary elections in a few weeks, and the possibility that the forces grouped around Mélenchon may do well, not to mention the forces grouped around Madame Le Pen. Mm-hmm. And therefore, the Élysée is trying to preempt those
exactly. It's all political.
For reaching out to various constituencies.
That's exactly right. But nonetheless, you know, I hope it's not as cynical as Condi, not as, because I know it's cynical, not as cynical as Condi Rice's appointment by George W. Bush.
Yes. I wonder if in the spirit of Pan-Africanism, because we find that, you know, a lot of times things navigate back to France and to take France out of the center of things. And it's like, you know, as Pan-African, because I even like as my other panelists were speaking, Patricia, I was wondering, did Mr. Wright ever go to Africa? Did he go to Ethiopia? Did he try to communicate with that and everything? And I think, you know, it's to kind of see the world beyond Europe and to build relationship and know what's happening there.
I think, Natacha, you have a very good point there. France plays a particular role, though, because it claims to be universalist and it claims to be, so there is a kind of an ambiguous, you have to be very careful with the French regarding that, because the British are very clear about it. It's just the flag is, it's first, it's commerce, and then the subalterns, they stick to themselves. They don't have to imitate British culture. There's really a separatism that you find that is very similar in the States, of course, you know, where there is this notion of race mixing is an absolute no-no, both in the States and in the UK. I mean, we're talking about political discourse, and then, yeah. Whereas the French claim to be universalists and so forth. And with those claims, there is in the field some realities that are closer to that. You know, we didn't have here in France. I'm saying we because I married a Frenchman and I've been living here for 20 years, but I'm actually Haitian and my father's Black and so forth. So I'm kind of treading in different you know, trying to not play identity politics here, but I'm able to see both sides. And here in France, I think that it's a different type of racism. It's a different discourse. So yes, I take what you say. I think it's a very good point that we should decentralize the whole Pan-Africanism away from France, because here this is where the congresses were held. Remember, in the 1956 and 1959, you had Paris was supposed to represent something with all the you know, with France being a place where Blacks were free and we didn't kick them out of restaurants and so forth. So yes. So what do you think?
I think that all eyes should not be on France and what France is doing, because I think, you know, us who come from Africa and have an African ancestry, our eyes need to be on each other and on the continent of Africa, because at the end of the day, without the continent of Africa, we don't know where France would be today, right? Without
exactly.
Haiti, we don't know where France would be. So France has been very detrimental to Haiti. and its impact on Haiti and our people has not been a good thing. So I'm always a little bit cautious. For me, speaking personally, I would rather be knowing, okay, what's happening in Africa, what's happening in the different countries, and not be so focused. And I'm speaking very personally here, as not be so focused on Europe and what Europe is doing, because Europe will do what's best for Europe at the end of the day.
Absolutely. I agree 100%. But the French are, they always want to play that card, you see. And yeah.
Yeah, it's true. They said liberté, égalité, fraternité, and then yet they wanted to come back and enslave us. So, people, so they can say anything, but it doesn't matter. It's the track record that really counts, right? And what have you done? Have you done reparation? Because Haiti fought for its independence and we had to pay retributions to France.
Yes. Exactly.
You really want me to look at France? Let's talk reparation to Haiti, and let's talk about building Haiti from the money that France got out of Haiti, from all the resources it took from Haiti, from the people it took. So to me, that's when I will say, okay, let me look at France. Yeah, maybe there's something there.
Listen, you all realize that we are still live, and we've already taken a couple of minutes from our next panel, but this is what happened, like Vermonja also mentioned earlier, when we're at conferences, we're meeting in the hall, the conversations continue, we linger in the room. So it's all good. We're giving 3 minutes to see if more people would gather. 2 more minutes, that is, it's 2:33, we'll start at 2:35. And I will again greet the audience and do a little spiel and then introduce our keynote speaker. And then we'll take it from there. So in 2 minutes, but we are live, we are there. And one person who is very, very important for me, and one person that I know is a very important person also for Dr. Horne, my big sister, Claudine Michelle, Dr. Claudine Michelle of the HSA was looking for the link, and because I think she registered and she didn't give it, and I'd like her to be there at the very beginning. So at 2:35 we'll begin. Hopefully the link will make its way to her. I am so thrilled for the first day of the conference that we've had 2 amazing panels of scholars, brilliant scholars who've opened new doors, shed new lights on places that we have not looked at before. Incredible research. And I would second certainly my colleague and friend who's been in the planning committee from day one, Dr. Gerald Magloire, who's all the way out there in France at 9 p.m. and is with us in saying that she appreciates the way all the speakers from those 2 panels have gone into the archives and made these voices come out to us alive today. So I think we are really it's a great day, and can't wait to have our next speaker take the stage and again, broaden the conversation. We are almost at 2:35 and we are almost ready to again reopen. Let me just check and see if Dr. Michelle has made it in yet. Okay. I have sent the link myself, and I know 2 other people were working on it. So let me begin because it's 2:35. Good afternoon. And again, welcome all those who have been with us from the morning. We're thrilled that you're here. I'm Dr. Marie Lily Surratt, the Associate Director of the CUNY Haitian Studies Institute at Brooklyn College. We are continuing with the conference. And again, on behalf of the Institute, I want to thank you for joining us, staying with us for our May 2022 virtual conference this year, Relighting the Crossroads, historical and cultural encounters between Haitians and African Americans. Before I do introduce our keynote speaker, on behalf of the CUNY Haitian Studies Institute at Brooklyn College and the larger Haitian community, please help me thank the following individuals, members of the conference organizing committee who worked for over a year to assist us in planning this phenomenal conference. Yes, indeed phenomenal. Margaret Alexandre, Vermanja R. Alston, Asselin Charles, Margaret Cox, Gerald Danton Magloire, Paul Fadoul, Cynthia Hamilton, Jaira Placide, the amazing artist Gigi Magloire, who designed this image exclusively for the conference, and that is the symbol representing the conference out there, and the Africana Studies Department at Brooklyn College, where I also teach. I would be remiss if I did not thank community partners like Espace Creole as well, and Haitian American Foundation for Educational and Cultural Exchange, AFEC, that runs Haitiana TV and radio that always retransmits globally our events, which allow our events to multiply, audience to multiply over and over, and for our reach across the globe. Thank you so much for that. Now, the Institute is utterly grateful to have Dr. Gerald Horne as a keynote for our May 2022 conference, Relighting the Crossroads, Historical and Cultural Encounters between Haitians and African Americans. This HSI conference constitutes part of the series of events throughout the Haitian US diasporic community to mark Haitian Heritage Month. We are thankful you're here with us, though virtual, and we hope that next year we'll be in person at the next conference during Haitian Heritage Month. We are also asking our audience to remember to write your question in the chat. Now, it is a great honor to welcome Dr. Gerald Horne, who really needs no introduction. Dr. Horne, the Moores Professor of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston, has published 36 books, including the one titled Confronting Black Jacobins, the US, the Haitian Revolution, and the Origins of the Dominican Republic, which came out in 2015, where Dr. Horne explores the profound impact of the Haitian Revolution on the United States, which had remained a slave society after declaring its independence from colonial Britain in 1776 and declared all men are created equal. Dr. Horne argues that the Haitian Revolution inspired the enslaved and partisan of emancipation, while also examining the, quote, often fraught relationship between the United States and the island that is home to those two Caribbean nations, Haiti and the Dominican Republic today. Dr. Horne's book, The Dawning of the Apocalypse, The Roots of Slavery, White Supremacy, Settler Colonialism and Capitalism in the Long 16th Century, won the American Book Award in 2021. Once again, congratulations on that win, Dr. Horne. And now, ladies and gentlemen, our guests, our panelists, everyone gathered for the keynote for this conference, please help me welcome Dr. Gerald Horne. Screen is yours, sir.
Well, first of all, allow me to give sincere thanks to the Institute for allowing me to address you at this fraught moment in US, Haitian, and world history. The remarks I'm about to present to you will be based upon viewing ourselves not only as scholars, but engaged citizens, either citizens of the United States or Haiti, or in some cases both, or alternatively nationals of Canada, France, and other nations. My remarks will be a bell-shaped presentation in the sense that I will begin by illuminating some of the themes represented in the book that was just kindly mentioned that I published on the island in 2015. And then the heart of it will be a look at the scandalous maltreatment and mistreatment of Haitian migrants today as we speak and what is to be done about it. And finally, I'm going to be presumptuous and outline certain scholarly initiatives that I would hope that the Institute would deem possible to pursue. Now, a central theme of my remarks today is the historic ties uniting African Americans in Haiti, the subject of my aforementioned book, Confronting Black Jacobins, and soon to be published in French translation, thanks to Claudine Michel of UC Santa Barbara. By now, it should be well known that the Haitian Revolution was that rara avis, a world historic event. It marked a general crisis of the entire system of enslavement that could only be resolved with its collapse, including in North America. It's well known that a number of the revolts of the enslaved, including Gabriel's revolt in Virginia, had Haitian fingerprints, and the same could be said for the Louisiana revolt about 10 years later in 1811. The revolt in Barbados about 5 years later did mark Vesey's revolt in South Carolina approximately 2 centuries ago, and Nat Turner's revolt in Virginia approximately in 1831. Haiti also offered safe refuge to Black Americans fleeing the horrors of slavery. Haiti's diplomatic alliance with abolitionists, not least in London, placed inordinate pressure on Washington, just as during the US Civil War, Washington found that Haiti was one of the few reliable allies it could depend on. In the 20th century, many Black Americans spoke out loudly against the 2 decades-long US occupation regime on the island that concluded in 1934. Amongst the more insistent voices was that of the Black American hero, who we refer to as W.E.B. Du Bois, whose ancestral roots are embedded on the island. Indeed, later in my remarks, I will outline a number of possible projects for the Institute, but one I will note now is naming either an academic prize or the best article or book on Haitian studies to be named in honor of the man we call Dr. Du Bois. However, Du Bois was hardly alone. In my book on the Associated Negro Press, I detail how this Black American news agency based in Chicago provided adept English language reportage of the US occupation, reportage that in itself could be converted into a small book, in that its archive at the Chicago Historical Society is gargantuan and awaits a bevy of scholars. Today, cooperation between African Americans and Haiti is more important than ever. As I speak, this small planet could be on the verge of World War III, with the trigger being sighted in Central and Eastern Europe, perhaps because of the possibility of a global conflagration emerging. This has obscured strikingly the juxtaposition of Haitian migrants on the US-Mexico border versus those seeking to enter the United States from the Ukraine. This contradiction was noted by Felicia Prasad, the immigration reporter of the Harlem-based Amsterdam News Weekly, who a few months ago wrote pointedly that, quote, "There's another blatant difference that too few are addressing, and that is the double standard of how the United States is dealing with the surge of white Ukrainians to the Mexican border versus the treatment meted out to Black and brown immigrants. Thousands of Haitians," she said, "are fleeing because of gang war in their country, but are turned back by Mexican police and hard-riding US agents with lassos," unquote. Enrique Lucero, director of Tijuana, Mexico's immigration service, told the Reuters news agency that about 2,829 Ukrainians were awaiting admission to the United States. The difference is, while Black and brown immigrants have been turned back and told the border is closed per US federal law, speaking of Title 42, US officials have been allowing hundreds of Ukrainians into the United States per day through the San Ysidro crossing near San Diego, California. A few weeks ago, nearly 3,000 Ukrainians were processed by US border officials. In recent weeks, Germany and Austria have offered free train rides to Ukrainians. The European Union offers residence for 1 year, allowing social services and benefits, while Italy has prosecuted those Africans crossing the Mediterranean, not least from Libya, which was virtually destroyed about a decade ago by, of course, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Hungary built a border fence for similar malign purposes. Black and Muslim migrants are routinely pushed back with tear gas and water cannon crossing from Belarus into Poland and hit with water cannon in the freezing cold just months ago. Then there's the ongoing scandal of how African migrants seeking to escape Ukraine, particularly medical students in Kiev, are being roughhoused in the close US ally that is Poland. It is also Felicia Persaud of the Black American Weekly, the Harlem-based Amsterdam News, who has provided some of the most informative journalism on Haitians and immigration. That too is worthy of recognition by this institute, perhaps a prize to the reporter who is providing the most adroit and up-to-date journalism on the island. For example, in the May 5th, 2022 edition, she writes that the US Customs and Border Patrol have processed a record 3,274 Ukrainians in March alone, a jump of more than 1,100% from February. She railed against the deployment of Title 42, this US federal law that has been deployed to bar the arrival of Haitian migrants, while she writes, quote, "The red carpet is rolled out for Ukrainians to come in legally or not. Why has the US administration not seen the need to institute a similar Uniting for Africa or Uniting for Haiti program akin to the Uniting for Ukraine initiative for those fleeing civil war in Africa or Haiti, but with relatives here in the United States?" End quote. Instead, she writes, quote, "Between March 6th and 12th, 2022 alone, the International Organization for Migration in Haiti reported 1,082 Haitian migrants were returned by air and sea, while as of that period this year, 7,496 have been deported, with 80% of those returned from the United States. More than 27,000 were deported in 2021 alone. Her linking Africans and Haitians also points to another initiative that we as US or Haitian or dual nationals can pursue. I speak of the initiative to include Haiti in the ranks of the African Union, headquartered in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and likewise having the Haitian representative collaborate more closely with the CARICOM Secretariat in CARICOM, of course, being the Caribbean Community, a secretariat in Georgetown, Guyana, which has been flexing its muscles lately vis-a-vis Washington by threatening to boycott the hype Summit of the Americas to take place within weeks in Los Angeles. Not to mention the fact that the CARICOM and African Union hosted jointly a virtual summit just a few months ago, which broke new diplomatic ground. I had the fortune of watching on South African broadcasting an interview with Haiti's ambassador in Pretoria, South Africa, Jacques Junior Baril, who expressed confidence that Haiti would gain admittance to the African Union within weeks. This opens the door to Haiti returning to its historic role as the diplomatic leader of Africans in the diaspora to our mutual benefit. This would allow Haiti to work with the African Union, for example, in sponsoring human rights investigations into the maltreatment of Haitian migrants on the Texas-Mexico border and the California-Mexico border, or the spectacular maltreatment of Black Americans by police authorities, and as Buffalo exemplifies, by neo-Nazi forces as well. I dare say that many Black Americans would welcome an African Union human rights delegation in Buffalo, particularly one spearheaded by Haiti, in light of its impending admittance to the African Union. One of the most important Haitian appointments in recent decades will be the question of who will be appointed Haiti's ambassador to the African Union, for this envoy could easily serve as an important point of leverage on the part of the entire diaspora. For a victory for the diaspora in North America means a victory for the diaspora in Haiti. For consider, going back to my previous point, that at the same time that Washington is pledging to allow 100,000 Haitians Ukrainians into this country rather shortly, the influential New York Times columnist Bret Stephens is demanding that each and every one of these Ukrainians who want green cards, which would allow various benefits and employment, should receive same. This juxtaposition has not been unique to the United States, as Great Britain, albeit in a parsimonious fashion, has been welcoming Ukrainian migrants. They were arranging for other migrants, mostly Black and or Muslim, to be sent for, quote, processing, unquote, thousands of miles away to Rwanda in Central Africa, emulating Australia, which pioneered in this practice. This is nothing new. Recall that the 45th US president suggested that he desired more migrants from places like Norway, as opposed to what he referred to contemptuously as so-called S-hole countries, quote unquote. To be sure, if nothing else, this current migration juxtaposition should induce realism about not just the nature of the so-called West, no revelation to those who pay attention, but most of all about the purported leader, speaking of Washington. Above all, this realization should be grasped by those I call Haitianists, or those who study Haiti, who know that despite the vaunted language about all being created equal, post-1804, the infant Haitian Republic had few foes more hostile than the USA, up to and including sponsoring and endorsing the split on the island that led to Dominican secession in 1844, then helping to foment conflict between the two nations. Still, with all the past and present conflict that has racked US-Haitian relations, we should resolve to push forward. What I mean is on May 23rd, 2022, a few days from now, supposedly that will mark the day when Title 42 will be suspended. Recall that Title 42 allowed the 45th US president to turn away most migrants from the border. Recall that Title 42 is a public health measure that the 45th US president tried to put in place before the pandemic of early 2020 in an effort to turn away migrants rapidly. And Title 42 has been continued by the current regime in Washington. Title 42 supposedly was designed to keep disease out of the country. At some point, the US Congress passed a series of laws that essentially delegate to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention the ability to restrict entry into the United States when the agency's director deems that a public health emergency would be made worse by letting people into the country. Then the Border Patrol enforces these regulations. Thus, hypothetically, or actually, a Haitian family of asylum seekers steps onto US soil and the Border Patrol takes them to custody. They would be in a detention facility for days on end before they might be transferred to the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency of the US government. What many find remarkable is that President Biden, thought to be indebted to the Black vote, has continued this policy that has had disproportionately negative impact on Haitian migrants. This will also be a major issue in the November election, as the opposition Republicans will seek to drown out protests about the impending overturning of women's reproductive freedom by clamoring about immigration, non-Ukrainian immigration, that is. According to a news account of a few weeks back, the GOP, the Republican Party, will campaign on the issue that non-Ukrainian immigrants not only are a vector of disease, speaking of COVID, but per Trump in his opening campaign salvo in Manhattan in June 2015, these migrants are also, believe it or not, supposedly potential sex offenders. This defamation, this libel, feeds into the ultra-rightist narrative that any who disagree with them are likely pedophiles. This latter point ties into the ultra-right narrative that their opponents are child molesters, a talking point of the neo-Nazi QAnon faction of the Republican Party, symbolized by Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, which in turn is connected to hysteria in the classroom about what is taught to children and teenagers under the guise of fighting so-called critical race theory, which fundamentally means downplaying the teaching of slavery. What I'm trying to suggest in my remarks is that when we campaign against this hysteria that's visited upon Haitian migrants, we are also campaigning on behalf of ourselves, because this issue is being used not only as a dog whistle, but as a megaphone to whip up ultra-rightist sentiment that can come back to bite us all, as represented by the Buffalo massacre of a few days ago. Recall that during the Virginia gubernatorial election just months ago, a campaign issue that emerged was whether a novel by Nobel laureate Toni Morrison should be taught in high school. Speaking of Beloved, a novel about slavery, which became a major motion picture. Supposedly, this novel gave little Jennifer nightmares and therefore had to be banned. However, this institute should realize that attempts to ban the teaching of slavery, which is ongoing in this country, strikes near the heart of what is important to what I've just referred to as Haitianness. That is to say, a revolution culminating in 1804 that pivoted precisely on the abolition of enslavement. The wider point is that this dangerous turn in US and to a degree North Atlantic politics also presents a mortal danger to Haitian migrants, but Haitians, such as those of this institute more broadly. As noted, the impending lifting of Title 42 is said to appear to lead to unleashing a 2-year backlog of claims for migrants on top of the high volume of migrants who typically come to the western and southwestern borders in the spring. If this scenario unfolds post May 23rd and continues for weeks, expect not only the ultra-right wing to use this humanitarian issue demagogically as a campaign issue, expect more pain to be inflicted on Haitian migrants. In this context, pay careful and close attention to the latest so-called innovation from the federal agency known as the Department of Homeland Security in Washington. I refer to the so-called robot dog, 100 pounds strong, 4-leg machines produced by military contractor Ghost Robotics, which also produces the robot border patrollers with long-range guns. Supposedly, these robot warriors are only being used as of now for rail inspections and sentry duty on the border. These robots have a 4-hour battery life and are remote controlled by our species, speaking of humans. These robot warriors, or cyber pooches, as they call, fit into the larger fantasy about a smart wall at the border, a proposal with both Republican and Democratic Party backing. This smart wall, so-called, involves motion and light-sensitive fiber optic cables, aerial drones. I should underline this question of drones because they're becoming ever more important, not only in surveilling the border, but also in warfare, as the conflict in Ukraine demonstrates as we speak. And the conflict earlier between Armenia and Azerbaijan some months ago also demonstrated. These aerial drones, of course, have the potential to engage in surveillance and also dispense projectiles. They also are able to engage in facial recognition technology to intercept and deter migrants. This is assuredly sinister, though not necessarily effective. There has been difficulty in distinguishing between wandering cows and human beings. Still, these so-called innovations have forced migrants into detours and alternate routes, with many of them winding up dead in the deserts of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. And this forces them into more dangerous and rugged terrain, contributing to injury and, as noted, much worse. Other technological so-called innovations challenge US law on privacy, and now under threat by the aforementioned Dobbs reproductive freedom case from Mississippi. Thus, the Border Patrol has purchased cell phone tracking data from private companies and used it to arrest migrants at the border. These agents also use devices that can intercept cell phone data in real time, including text messages and voicemail, which means interception of those on the other end of this communication, meaning potentially Haitian Americans and other US nationals are having their telecommunications now being surveilled, whether they know it or not. Border Patrol is also seizing biometric data, presumably for alleged licit purposes, but raising the possibility of all manner of scientific absurdities. If they do not submit biometric data, migrants will be refused entry at the border. In 2018, about 180,000 photos of migrants were hacked for purposes unknown, but again, raising all manner of scientific absurdities. In other words, biometric data is being gathered from Haitians and other migrants, but those who are gathering this data are not able to prevent that data from being hacked, and who knows what that hacked data is being used for. All this data includes that of Haitians, then becomes part of law enforcement databases and remains accessible for at least 75 years. Then there is the demand that migrants wear location tracking and ankle monitors. Interestingly, companies that build immigrant jails or detention centers are involved with this technology too. BI Incorporated is part of the GEO Group, GEO, one of the major players in the detention center business. Obviously, this opens the necessity, if not the possibility, of we acting as alarmed and engaged citizens of filing stockholders' resolutions at the annual meetings of these corporations, and otherwise working with like-minded progressive forces to circumscribe the ability of these corporations, such as the GEO Group, to engage in wrongdoing. These corporations then create a self-perpetuating lobby that demands even more of our tax dollars for the purpose of discriminatory treatment, coddling Ukrainians versus bruising Haitians, for example. Remote monitoring, or what is called euphemistically e-carceration, unquote, is their latest so-called innovation. Even the limited right to a bond hearing for migrants, which some detained immigrants have, does not apply to e-carceration, that is to say, electronic shackling. At times, those who are physically frail or pregnant are subject to ankle shackling. As private businesses become dominant in this migrant industrial complex, which throws off handsome profits, more disreputable concerns into the fray. A corporation called Libre by Nexus has made millions by providing surety for immigrants who need assistance from bail bondsmen so they can avoid being locked up. Then Libre fits immigrants with electronic shackles, Then Libre charges the migrants outrageous monthly fees. Of course, Libre has been sued for deceptive business practices, and in turn, Libre has sued its own subcontractors, harassing them by phone. So-called e-carceration can also lead to devastating mental and physical harm. Wearing ankle monitors can lead to swelling, numbness, cramps, which can be particularly damaging to pregnant women. Monitors at times, these electronic shackles, have exploded in flames or delivered electronic shocks. One study revealed that 12% of migrants subjected to electronic shackling concluded that it made them feel suicidal. 71% said it led to depression. Perversely, the Biden administration has awarded Geo Group and BI Incorporated yet another lucrative contract that not only involves electronic monitoring, but mandates house arrest. Yet, the foregoing notwithstanding, it is worth reflecting once again on what occurred quite monstrously last September 2021, when scenes from the Del Rio refugee camp in Texas horrified the world as we witnessed mounted US border police terrorizing Haitian refugees, whipping people with their reins to turn them back from the US border, evoking the brutality of chattel slavery. The images unmask the US government's racist disregard and contempt for Haitian lives. Del Rio, Texas has faded from the headlines, and the Biden administration nonetheless has doubled down on sending Haitian refugees back to a country that its own State Department has designated as being in the category of highest travel risk. Even before last July's assassination of the Haitian president, US authorities acknowledged that Haiti was undergoing, quote, a deteriorating political crisis, violence, and staggering increase in human rights abuses, unquote. Since September, over 20,000 Haitians to date have been forcibly returned to Haiti. In one recent month, 49 chartered flights left the United States filled with Haitian refugees, often chained and shackled without food or water. They are dropped off at the Haitian airport in the capital with nothing to their name. Some are women, 35 to 36 weeks pregnant. On another front of global policing, in collaboration with Caribbean countries like the Dominican Republic and Bahamas, the US Coast Guard extends its armed patrols far in the Caribbean to hunt down and return Haitians before they ever get near US borders. During 1 week in late January 2022, the Coast Guard intercepted 88 Haitians near the Bahamas and returned them to Haiti. Another 191 Haitians were intercepted near the southern Bahamas. We cannot discuss this country's indefensible treatment of Haitian refugees without addressing the role Washington plays in creating the circumstances that drive people to flee. 18 years of foreign intervention and occupation since the 2004 US-backed coup that overthrew the president, Mr. Aristide, had brought only widespread misery, insecurity, and violence. The immediate US so-called United Nations occupation response to the 2010 earthquake in Haiti that killed tens of thousands of people was heightened military presence in and around Haiti because the Obama administration feared an exodus of migrants. The US launched the infamous Bush, Obama, Clinton plan, an undisguised global corporate NGO grab bag to plunder Haiti's resources and make a profit. We need to unpack the racism of the mainstream media that talks as if these things are endemic to Haiti or to a so-called failed state or to African people in general. They repeat one racial trope after another and fail to make the connections between the horrific conditions facing Haitians and the US orchestrated policies that have created them. Once again, let me underline what I mentioned a moment ago, is that the Institute should consider awarding a prize to the journalism that best depicts Haiti in all of its glory, and thereby helps to beat back the menace of these mainstream media approaches that engage in racism. The US border industry maintains secret detention centers across this country, which are designed to deny people access to the outside world. That is to say, deny access to family, attorneys, interpreters, and the media. Haitian refugees in US custody are being detained in freezing crowded cells without adequate food or water, without sanitation or basic medical care, and without knowing why or for how long. In recent decades, these outrages sparked massive worldwide protests. Within the United States, a vibrant movement consisting of the Haitian diaspora, prominent Black activists and artists, college students, churches, human rights, labor, and anti-imperialist activists emerged. In 1992, 80-year-old choreographer Catherine Dunham undertook a 47-day hunger strike to protest the Bush administration's policy of repatriating Haitian refugees. Tennis champion Arthur Ashe was arrested in front of the White House, along with other leading Black activists at a protest organized by the NAACP. 2 years later, Trans-Africa, a NGO then based in Washington, their director, Randall Robinson, fasted nearly a month to protest the Clinton administration's policy of returning refugees to Haiti without hearings on asylum. Once again, the Institute, in order to incentivize this kind of activism, should consider an award, either annually or otherwise, to the activist or activist organization that is in the front lines of protesting this kind of maltreatment and mistreatment. The fight for refugee rights has never been more urgent, not only for Haitians, but for displaced peoples across the world. Consistent advocacy work for Haitian refugees is underway, and therefore, let me reiterate my previous plea that the Institute should consider giving an award to various community organizations, churches, refugee rights, and grassroots organizations in the forefront of protesting these outrages. As citizens, we should embrace this work and join in the demand to stop the deportations. Obviously, we stand with Haitians and all other refugees. However, because my time is expiring, I'll skip over more detailing of these outrages and go to what I consider to be what is near the heart of my remarks, which is the request that the Institute consider developing a series of prizes, not only for activists, but for scholars, also for the member of the Congressional Black Caucus in Washington, who might be in the forefront of protesting these outrages. That is to say, how can the Institute intervene, weigh in, with the aim of shifting the balance towards true Haitian sovereignty and justice for Haitian migrants? As citizens, of course, I recommended that we work closely with our representatives at the African Union and CARICOM Secretariat. However, most of us are scholars, or Haitianists, as I call us, and here is where we can make a particular difference. Allow me to make a modest proposal that, if effectuated, could ignite more research on Haiti, heightening the nation's profile in the international community to the benefit of the entire nation. I propose that the Institute convene a board of scholars who would direct an international project that in the first instance would canvass hemispheric neighbors for documents on the momentous and profound issue of Haiti and the abolition of slavery. For example, we all know the close ties historically between Haiti and Jamaica. Many of us have conducted research at the Jamaica Archive at Spanish Town and are well aware of the riches contained there. The same holds true for Havana, Barbados, and Trinidad. I imagine the same holds true for most of the member states of CARICOM and the Organization of American States. would suggest an outreach to the Secretariat of both. The idea would be to work with our counterparts at the University of West Indies, the University of Havana, and like-minded institutions to scan these documents and then choose a portion for publication and placing others online. Ultimately, the idea would be to expand to Caracas, Bogota, Quito with the same aim and method. Ideally, the authorities in Haiti would be involved at the relevant ministry. And though I realize this is quite sensitive, even controversial, requiring maximum deliberation, but this should also include an outreach to UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, headquartered in Paris, where we know Haiti has many friends. That is to say, outside of the administrative and political structures. Domestically, there are a number of potential donors, including the Mellon Foundation. A possible model to emulate is the Radio Haiti collection at Duke University in North Carolina, where Laura Wagner, the eminent scholar activist, did quite a bit of the heavy lifting. These audio files document a tumultuous era from 1957 to 2003, with the bulk being from 1972 to 2003, where under the leadership, as you know, Michel Montas and Jean-Dominique, a rich resource for scholars was developed, rich resources for not only scholars, but radio producers and filmmakers for generations to come, made possible by the National Endowment for the Humanities of the USA, another entity the Institute should pursue, consisting of interviews, reportage, roundtable discussions, call-ins, mostly from the capital, but including Gonaive. This archive is a superb gift to Haiti history. The collection stretches for 100 linear feet and includes hundreds of audio cassettes, not to mention numerous VHS cassettes, much of which can be accessed online, suggesting worldwide access. Much of this archive is in English, French, and Creole, giving a further breadth. It would be useful for the Haitianist community to consolidate resources. For example, the Institute should consider collaborating with the Center for Black Studies and the Journal of Haitian Studies to sponsor Center of Black Studies at UC Santa Barbara and the Journal of Haitian Studies to sponsor a book and article prize for the best work done in our field over the previous year. Recall my earlier reference to the Bois Prize in this context. This prize should bring a monetary reward and can be endowed either by contributions from scholars like myself and or donations from the Haitian diaspora. This Haitian consortium, which I've just sketched, should also consider providing seed funding for ambitious research projects, and as well a prize for the best translation into Creole, into French, into English, into Spanish, and other languages. We should also consider a prize for the best project utilizing one of Haiti's underappreciated jewels, the National Archives in the capital. And likewise, in our archival digging, we should not ignore this repository in terms of posting online correspondence. I know from my own research published in my book a few years ago that this archive contains tremendously important correspondence from the 19th century with various nations, and this facet needs to be highlighted. We Haitianists, as I term ourselves, should provide an example for others to follow. For example, Haiti should take advantage of its sovereignty and establish a model for Black Americans to follow, as Haiti did in the 19th century, by not only seeking assistance from Washington and Brussels, but also Tokyo and Beijing too. Brothers and sisters, we have much work to do, but the fact is that in the past, we overthrew slavery and we destabilized apartheid in both South Africa and the United States. And this gives us confidence that yes, we shall overcome today and tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Wow. Thank you so much, Dr. Horne, for this passionate, thorough presentation that includes so many suggested propositions that will certainly sit down and digest and discuss with our executive committee and advisory board at the Haitian Studies Institute. Indeed, I have to say, we expect this conference and the various conversations happening inside the space that we've created here will actually yield some immediate outcomes and inspire a number of initiatives, which in the long term will foster greater understanding of our history, culture between Haitian and African Americans, but also, I think very importantly, as you underscore, will bring greater solidarity in our collective struggles against white supremacy. And I thank you for all these major and important issues raised around the Haitian migrants crisis, among others, and that incarceration that you also so clearly outlined, because I will also add to your testimony that I myself have been with women who are carrying those anklets and the shame, the nightmares that go with it, the embarrassment for them to walk the streets with this thing on their legs, particularly the women who choose not to wear pants or do not wear pants large enough to cover those ankle bracelets. In fact, I think you hit it right on the nose, because I think it's a way of criminalizing people who are not criminals. And I thank you for bringing that to the forefront and to talk about this. But I'm going to open up, because we only have about 8 minutes left, and we invite the audience to pose questions in the chat, or if they so want in the Q&A, but possibly in the chat if that's what they have. I wanted to ask you to begin the conversation by asking you, what are some of the things that you think the African American community itself can be doing to accompany the Haitians in the US diaspora to demand that the US stop this double standard treatment of Haitian migrants as we know it? What can the African American community in the United States do to kind of bond us, bring us closer together for our fights against white supremacists and this mistreatment characterize this comportment?
Well, I think, first of all, as I noted, I spoke both as a citizen and as a scholar. I think speaking as a citizen, what we need to do, obviously, is put more pressure on Washington. What that means programmatically and tactically is that we need to energize somehow the organizations that purport to represent us. I'm speaking, for example, of the NAACP, and particularly its chapters in Brooklyn and in South Florida, which, of course, those two communities have sizable Haitian American and Haitian migrant populations. I think that we should encourage the NAACP in turn to work with the Congressional Black Caucus, 43 members strong, to hold hearings on the Texas-Mexico border, on the San Diego-Mexico border, where Haitian migrants would be questioned as to what kind of pain they've been enduring as a result of this kind of penalty and punishment. But I think as well, we should not neglect the international community, which is why I spent so much time underscoring what I consider to be a very profoundly important development, which is that Haiti, presumably in the next few days or weeks, will gain admission to the African Union, the first country outside of the boundaries of Africa itself that will have such a role. This will allow Haiti to then reassert and reassume its historic role as the leader of the African diaspora. And in that instance, I would urge the Haitian ambassador to the African Union, once this issue is settled bureaucratically within days or weeks, to push a resolution at the African Union for the African Union to send a human rights delegation to the Texas-Mexico border, to the San Diego-Mexico border, to once again take testimony from migrants, because we recognize that the United States does not like to be embarrassed in the eyes of the international community. Since we know that that is the fact, it's our job to embarrass the United States before the eyes of the international community, because when they are embarrassed, they tend to change their tune. As Black Americans who study history, we know that. We know that if they had not been embarrassed in the international community, they would not necessarily have retreated from US apartheid beginning in the 1950s. So we should recognize what our strengths are. We should recognize where our leverage rests, and then we should pursue that policy.
We invite you to drop your questions in the chat, your comments. A few comments. Gerald Danton Magloire, who's in France at Dr. Horne, the Duke University Archives on Haiti are essential. Thank you for reminding us. Sharing your sources is a great gift. From Gerald Danton Magloire, member of the planning committee, who's in France, and it's very late in France, but is hanging in there with us. Dr. Margaret Alexandre also, thank you, Dr. Horne. Thank you for such Darrell Mutula Nyengu. Thank you for such a wonderful presentation. We ask you to please feel free to drop questions because we have about 3 more minutes. But indeed, Dr. Horne, well, go ahead, sir.
Well, I wanted to also mention, somehow I forgot, that my own archive, my papers are in New York City, a subway ride away from where you're sitting in Brooklyn. And it includes all my research notes from my book on Haiti, including research in the French diplomatic archives all across the United States, research in Haiti. Also in that archive are research notes from Jamaica and Cuba as well. And so I recommend that our scholars take advantage of that, particularly scholars who are headquartered a subway ride away from the Schomburg Library of the New York Public Library at 135th Street in Harlem.
Thank you for saying that. And while on that note, I want to let others know that the Haitian Studies Institute, one of its main objectives in the coming year and years to come is to develop a huge and important archive. So if you have papers, Dr. Horne, that you would like to send our way, we'll be more than happy to be one of the recipients of your papers where we could share it with the Schomburg. So to others in the audience, when you come across those important archives that are out there that really contains the history and the voices of those people who came before us, please do think of the Haitian Studies Institute at Brooklyn College. We are in the midst of building this archive because we do want the Institute to be one of the destinations for people in the Americas and outside of the Americas doing research on Haiti to come to. We also, let me mention here, we also hope that this conference will encourage a surge in scholarship on historical and cultural encounters, a new surge that is, because we know Dr. Horne and others have done their share, but we encourage there's more. As the scholars who spoke this morning, there are many things to uncover still ahead. And we also hope that we will be able to collect all the papers from all the presenters and publish that will be available at our next year May conference. So we will collect the papers from our presenters and have a publication of this conference that will be available next year when we do our May 2023 conference during Haitian Heritage Month. Are there any questions? Because we're like 1 minute away from saying what an amazing day this has been. And we could not thank Dr. Horne enough for being that voice throughout the years, but that voice, that staunch champion for Haiti and the significance of Haiti in telling the story of the Black experience, the Black transatlantic experience. So it's 3:30. I don't know if people want to, no question. They were dazzled by your presentation. Nobody had any questions, but certainly if you have something, you want to unmute yourself and you want to do a little bit of exchange, you're welcome, but it's 3:30. We thank you all for having spent the day with us, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow at 11 a.m. again, where we will begin the day with the Harlem and Haiti Activist and Artistic Encounters, moderated by Dr. Aslan Charles. And on that panel, we will have Dr. Khadidra Monet-Martin, Dr. Felix Jean-Louis, and Dr. Joubert Satir. Of course, the program is available online. You can take a look at it, but we want to thank you for being there with us. We think it was a phenomenal day, and what a way to end the day, Dr. Horne. Thank you so very much for your scholarship, for your passion, for your work, and for being such a voice for the Haitian.
Here.
Yes.
Excellent. Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Horne.
Thank you.
Yes, as Lily has said, we're just speechless. I mean, this is an incredible bit of communication to us, and we're processing it, and we're very eager to respond. Very eager. We're just it's just limited by time, but you will hear from us.
Right on.
And I am so, as someone who worked with immigrant populations, the Haitian immigrant population here, Haitian refugees, I was enthralled. I was really happy that you grounded the work in reality, in time, and bringing these issues to the surface. And the idea of demanding that there's a hearing on the Mexico border is something that I think our allies, African Americans and non-African Americans, can come together and help us to certainly demand that it be looked into, because there's been some people have been criminalized who are seeking refuge. People don't leave. There's no place like home. When you leave your home, you're in search of a better life. You're in search of something that you feel is going to be better than home. I mean, one of the songs in Haitian Creole that I've used in my writing is for us to say, I'm going to look for life someplace else. It's because where we are is unlivable. And to then take these people seeking refuge and criminalize them in those ways. The images on the border reminded all of us of the time of slavery, certainly. And I know I've had interaction, many interactions with people who were removed, made to disappear, I would say, from the border, because we didn't send them doesn't mean the crisis ended. They were still with these ankle monitors, and they immediately faced removal proceedings. A lot of people don't realize that they're not paroled into the United States, which is why those chartered planes are going every day in and day out. So I'm glad you zero in your presentation in something very current, something very significant, and something that we should use as Black collectivities here to denounce the practices of white supremacy, because it is part of it. It is part of that. So Natacha Brookshire said, impressed by the breadth of your knowledge, 36 books, 36 publications, and some of these papers is going to be coming to the Haitian Studies Institute, right, Dr. Horne?
Of course.
Of course, certainly. And we cannot wait to have you in person. We definitely hope this conference will happen in person next year. And even if you're not a keynoter, we would love you to be there and engage in continuing the conversations, because it cannot be a one-shot deal. That's why I tell people all the time, conversation is ongoing, and that's how we resolve matter. It's not you sit and you talk about it and it's over. We will have many conversations. We've been having conversations, so we'll continue to have many more conversations. It is 3:34. Where conference is over, but we're happy that you guys are hanging out. Both panelists and attendees are here now, but we are still being recorded. We probably should stop the recording, and then we can begin to chit chat with one another, because it's also a reunion. Just like when we go to CSA,